I don't think Sri Lanka has freedom of religion or belief, particularly in relation to minority religion.
The freedom of association is restrained under freedom of religion or belief when you are not allowed to meet in your home, when there is a registration that it is illegal.
Sinhala Buddhist actors are encroaching into the freedom of religion of minority communities, and the state is standing on the side of these Sinhala Buddhist actors and are watching or even aiding the encroachment of this freedom of religion of minority communities.
The ICCPR Act Section 3 is meant to protect all communities. Now here, when you instrumentalize it to weaponize the provision against minority communities, it completely loses the objective for which it was enacted.
I wouldn't say that the victim's profile is what necessarily governs the application or misapplication of the ICC. I think it's the target that governs it. I wouldn't say that the identity of the victim is the determining factor.
Stand-up comedian Natasha Edrisuriya was arrested and kept in remand prison for over a month under Section 3 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR Act, after being accused of insulting Buddhism during the performance of a comedy show in April 2023.
Natasha Edrisuriya බුදුහාමුදුරුවෝ සිදුහත් කුමාරයා කාලේ සිදුහත් කුමාරයා බබා කාලේ ඒ සමවයස් ළමයින්ට මාර ප්‍රෙෂර් එකක් තියෙන්න ඇති. අර සුද්ධෝදනගේ ළමයා ඒ ළමයා ඉපදුණු දවසේම ඇවිදින. ඒකට මේගොල්ලෝ තාම කෙලින් කරලා වඩා ගත්තාම බෙල්ල කඩා ගන්නවා. අර සුද්ධෝදනගේ පොඩි එකා ඉපදුණු දවසේ කවියක් කියලා.
Few weeks after, Edrisuriya was released by Colombo High Court Judge Aditya Patibandi, who said in his 12-page bail order that the ICCPR had to be interpreted within freedom of speech and expression. Instead of critiquing Edrisuriya's arrest on flimsy charges, most media wasted no time in amplifying the voices of Buddhist monks and politicians who justified her arrest.
ඇගේ ඉදිරිපත් කිරීම ආරම්භයේ සිටම බෞද්ධ ආගමට, කිතුණු ආගමට හා ඉස්ලාම් ආගමට අපහාස කරමින් නරඹන්නන් සිනහා ගැස්වීමයි. ආගම්වලට ගරහන නතාෂාගේ ප්‍රහසන කලාවට විවිධ පාර්ශවද බරපතල විවේචන එල්ල කරමින් පවතිනවා.
අසභ්‍ය දේවල් කතා කරමින් ඒ තුල කුණු අවුස්සමින් මිනිස්සුන්ව සිනහවට පත් කරන එක කරන්නේ.
මෙන්න මේ කාන්තාව අත්අඩංගුවට අරන් මෝටේ එරෙහිව නීතිය ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්න කියලා.
නටාෂා එදිරිසූරිය කියන තැනැත්තිය. මේ කවුද කියලාවත් අපි දන්නේ නැහැ. ජෝකර් කෙනෙක් කියලා විතරයි දන්නේ.
මේක මේ සැලසුම් සහගත නොදැනුවත්කම නිසා නෙමෙයි. මේවා කියලා ජනතාව අතර ප්‍රකෝපකාරී හැඟීම් ඇති කළා මේ කරන වැඩේට අපි සම්පූර්ණ විරුද්ධව ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙන්න ඕනේ.
අද ආගමකට අගෞරව කිරීම බුදුරජාණන් වහන්සේගේ ධර්මයේ විවේචනය කරන එක අපේ හැමෝම සාමාන්‍යකරණය කරලා තියෙනවා. මේ අරගලේ ප්‍රතිපල.
මේ රටවල් තියෙන එකම හිසරදේ තමයි මේක බෞද්ධ රටක් වීම සහ මේ බෞද්ධයන්ගේ තියෙන එකමුතුකම. බුදුන්ට මේව අපහාස කළාට මං හිතන්නේ වෙනත් ආගම් වලට අපහාස කරන්න හිතන්නවත් නැහැ.
Edrisuriya's arrest marks the latest in a recent spate of incidents which demonstrate a pattern of instrumentalization of the ICCPR Act by the Sri Lankan state. What can also be deduced from these recent high-profile arrests is that the state has used the ICCPR Act on the grounds to protect Buddhism, Buddhist icons, and Buddhist clergy.
The ICCPR Act itself, it means it's called the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights Act. So it's ironical that the ICCPR Act, particularly the Section 3 of the ICCPR, which talks about protecting the society from extremism and war and religious divides or communal divides. And that is what Section 3 of the ICCPR is all about. That it is used for the right opposite purpose of why such a section would even exist in law. So I would say that particular section has been overwhelmingly used against minorities, particularly the Muslim community in recent times, soon after the Easter Sunday attacks. So they would combine the ICCPR and the Prevention of Terrorism Act together, and they would charge people. But generally speaking, the ICCPR has been used against anyone who is speaking against the status quo of Sinhala Buddhism. So if you see the arrest of Shaktika, the short story writer, he actually wrote something which irked the Sinhala Buddhist status quo. So they arrested him. Similarly, recently, Natasha Idri Surya, who was a stand-up comedian, her comedy irked the Sinhala Buddhist status quo. So she was arrested. So soon after the Easter Sunday attack, for instance, people like Dilshan Mohammed was charged under the ICCPR. Ramzi Razik was charged under the ICCPR because they spoke against a certain kind of status quo. Dilshan Mohammed was, for instance, was warning the state long before the Easter Sunday attacks that there is a violent element brewing in the Muslims, in certain sections of the Muslim community. He was warning the state, and the state did not heed the warning, and then the Easter Sunday attacks happened, and then they scapegoated the same person who was warning the state. So in that sense, soon after the Easter Sunday attack against the Muslim community was not necessarily critiquing the Sinhala Buddhist ideology or whatever, but they combined it with the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and they created the narrative and idea that the Muslim community at large was propagating war against the state, and so therefore they were able to charge many Muslims and Muslim activists and authors and poets under this ICCPR Act.
There have been instances where the ICCPR has been used against the Muslim minority, and it has also been used as intimidation by the police, saying we will file action against Christians who have preached either on comparative religion, saying that when you preach on comparative religion it causes disharmony.
So Section 3 of the ICCPR Act criminalizes the advocacy of hatred against a national, regional, religious or racial community, and where that advocacy constitutes incitement. And incitement is also divided into several categories: incitement to violence, incitement to discrimination, or incitement to hostility. Now, this section is modeled on Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So ICCPR stands for International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So it's very much the international standard on incitement. The provision in practice, however, has been misapplied in two ways. On the one hand, it is yet to be deployed to secure the convictions of those who have actually engaged in incitement to violence. Now, we know in our recent history there have been several episodes of mob violence, particularly targeting the Muslim community, that took place as a result of incitement, particularly by militant groups online. And it seems that though arrests were made at various points, these arrests haven't translated into prosecutions and finally convictions. So there is still a gap in terms of the enforcement of Section 3 of the ICCPR Act as far as incitement is concerned. the second way the ICCPR Act is misapplied is that it's actually applied to situations that don't constitute incitement. So you have situations where particular speech can be insulting or offensive towards a religious community or a religious figure or even a religious symbol. And it does not really involve incitement of a particular community to commit acts of violence or discrimination or hostility. But we see the ICCPR Act applied to those circumstances. Now, you could have a situation where an insult is by design attempting to incite violence. But then you also can have insults that are just insults and that are offensive, and no one is actually incited to commit violence against any community, but people are generally offended or upset or hurt by those comments. Now, the ICCPR Act is not designed to apply to those circumstances, but we have had several examples where such statements or expressions have been brought within the ambit of the ICCPR Act. A good example is Shaktika Satkumara, who wrote a short story that was seen as offensive to the clergy, the Buddhist clergy, and it was also seen as offensive towards certain figures within the Buddhist tradition. Now, there was a complaint made against Shaktika, and what happened was the ICCPR Act, Section 3, was applied to his situation. And he was arrested, he was denied bail for a period of time, and eventually discharged because it transpired that Section 3 was not really relevant to that kind of situation. So we've seen a pattern of this, where several examples can be taken, where the ICCPR Act is applied to situations that fall dramatically short of the of incitement, that standard of incitement. Now, in 2019, the Human Rights Commission actually issued a set of guidelines and wrote to the IGP, wrote to the Attorney General about this problem. And that was after Shaktika's case. But we found that this pattern of applying the ICCPR Act to situations that fall short of incitement continues. There have been instances where members of minority communities have been targeted by the ICCPR Act in a manner that's not in good faith, and I can think of several examples. But there's also been instances where people that clearly come from the majority community, or at least have backgrounds from the Buddhist tradition and are Sinhalese by ethnicity, who have faced consequences under the ICCPR Act, and a good example of that would be Shaktika Satkumara. Then you also had people like Sepal Amar Singh, who was arrested under the ICCPR Act. So I wouldn't say that the victim's profile is what necessarily governs the application of or misapplication of the ICCPR Act. I think it's the target that governs it. What is potentially being targeted by the speech. And in all these examples, the common target has been some symbol or some figure or a clergyman from the Buddhist tradition. So that, I think, is the general trend or the pattern when it comes to the application of the ICCPR Act. I wouldn't say that the identity of the victim is the determining factor.
But the ICCPR Act isn't the only legal framework which has been interpreted and instrumentalized by the state apparatus to curb certain constitutionally guaranteed fundamental freedoms, including freedom of religion or belief of minorities. Article 9 of Sri Lanka's constitution accords a foremost place for Buddhism, which is followed by a larger portion of the majority Sinhala population, while guaranteeing to all religions rights provided by Article 10, 12 and 14. Members of the majority Sinhala Buddhist community derive a sense of entitlement from this constitutional provision, while making ethno-religious minority communities feel permanently subjugated to the majority community. The provision also places the onus on the state to foster and protect Buddhism, consequently conferring power and political advantage to the majority Sinhala Buddhist community.
Because there's no clear definition of what it means to give foremost place to Buddhism, you do find politicians instrumentalizing. It's not only politicians. I mean, various segments of society seem to think that in all matters, Buddhism has to be given priority. Now, the fact is, when you look at the history of Sri Lanka, the influence of Buddhism is very pervasive. You can't deny that. But the issue is about the constitutional provisions. So I think it does appear to be very difficult, to amend Article 9 even in a future constitution unless there's a big change of heart. Buddhism is not going to go away from this country, because there is no provision in the constitution. But this is a very sensitive point. So I think the solution would be to have a very strong and very definitive interpretation on the part of the Supreme Court. Now, in a recent judgment and also in a couple of previous judgments, the Supreme Court has pronounced that despite Article 9, Sri Lanka is a secular state. So those are from, the judgments were given by three judge benches. So we have to see, what a definitive position is.
Historically, as a right, freedom of religion for Sri Lanka's Buddhists was first codified in 1815 in the Kandyan Convention signed between the British colonial rulers and members of the Kandyan aristocracy following the fall of Sri Vikramarajasinghe, the last king of Kandy. The implementation of the Colebrook-Cameron reforms from 1833 provided a framework for all religions to be given equal status following the recognition of the country's administration as one territorial unit. However, in 1834, foreign missionaries that were spreading Christianity through education initiated a campaign to disassociate the state from Buddhism, as they felt the state's support for Buddhism prevented local communities from embracing Christianity. Some historians' writings mention that the state's attempt to de-link state and religion in contravention of the Kandyan Convention contributed in part to the 1848 Matale Rebellion. Later in 1914, Ceylon celebrated its first National Day, which was organized to recognize and celebrate the Ceylonese national identity, which represented all ethno-religious communities living in the island. The provision of special status to Buddhism was first introduced in the 1972 Constitution on the back of a long campaign during the 1960s. This decision has often been cited as a fundamental flaw in Sri Lanka's post-independence nation-building process.
I can think of at least three problems with how the Constitution protects fundamental rights. One is that there is an article that states very clearly that laws and even unwritten law that came into being before the promulgation of the Sri Lankan Constitution in 1978 will remain operational and remain valid, notwithstanding inconsistencies with the fundamental rights chapter. So you have a whole plethora of laws that are deeply problematic, that are incompatible with our fundamental rights, that by virtue of Article 16 continue to be valid. So you have certain offences, for example, that are found in the Penal Code, which happen to have been enacted back in 1883 by the British colonial administration, probably in a very different time when the British were fixated with this idea of public order and maintaining intercommunal relations, because any kind of clash between communities was not good for the economy that it wanted to administer. You had all these strange offences that were probably probably appropriate, or let's not even say appropriate, but probably typical of that time, being brought into our penal code. So wounding religious feelings, outraging the religious sentiment of a particular class. All of these things were brought in by the British under the Penal Code. Now, those offences may very well be incompatible with the freedom of expression today. But they continue to be valid because Article 16 has that very specific provision that protects those laws. And you have a range of other laws on our statute books, particularly laws that are incompatible with the right to non-discrimination on the grounds of sex, which are clearly discriminatory towards women, that continue to be valid because of Article 16. So that's one of the doctrinal problems that I see. The second is that the grounds on which fundamental rights may be restricted are extremely broadly phrased. So Article 15 has a bunch of sub-paragraphs that permit or that set out the permission for the state to restrict fundamental rights. And there are certain grounds that are set out in those paragraphs. Those grounds are very broadly framed, right? So for example, there's this idea that you can restrict rights for the general welfare of the community or for what's required in a democracy. Those are very vague terms, and then you can use those terms to justify all kinds of restrictions, and that has been done in this country. So I think the way limitation clauses are phrased and framed might be another doctrinal problem. The final problem I see is with Article 9 of the Constitution, which imposes on the state a specific duty to protect and foster the Buddha Sasana. Now, that seems like a perfectly harmless duty in the context of a state that has a state religion. But we say we don't have a state religion, we are supposed to be a secular state. So there is an incompatibility that Article 9 brings into the Fundamental Rights chapter, because the Fundamental Rights chapter suggests that all religions and all communities adhering to certain religions are equal, and there cannot be any discrimination on the grounds of religion. So Article 12, paragraph 2 says that. So how do you reconcile that with Article 9? And that's always been a tension within the Constitution that I see as a problem. So those are the three weaknesses I see, and the experience of fundamental rights, or the experience of individuals and groups in terms of their fundamental rights is often hampered by what takes place under these specific articles I mentioned. Therefore, the problem is not just a theoretical problem, not just an abstract problem. In practice, they start to manifest.
Article 15 of Sri Lanka's constitution authorizes the state to limit certain fundamental freedoms on the grounds of public interests. Article 15 also provides for limitations on fundamental rights originating from emergency regulations promulgated under Public Security Ordinance of 1947, which are not enacted by Parliament. This effectively means the country's executive can enforce limitations on fundamental rights by way of emergency regulations with no legislative deliberation and little or no legislature scrutiny. Although emergency regulations are required to be presented for Parliament for approval. The state apparatus regularly enforces limitations on freedom of religion or belief and freedom of expression, purportedly for reasons of public interests such as national security, public order, public health, and public morality. There is a predictable overlap between majoritarian interests and the way public officials and judges interpret public interests.
The problem in Sri Lanka is the meaning given to these various grounds, these interests that we call national security, public order, public health, tend to encapsulate the majority community's interest. So then the word public or the word national is not truly public or national, but really synonymous with a particular community's interest. And we see that in the way rights are experienced. I'll give you a couple of examples. Now, you can restrict the freedom of religion or belief on the grounds of public order and national security under our constitution. That's permitted. And of course, what can be restricted is the external manifestation of one's religion. So your actual ability to choose a religion and have a conviction cannot be restricted under any grounds. And that's found in Article 10, and Article 10 is what we call an absolute right, which cannot be restricted. But your ability to manifest your religion, say through practice, through your attire, through a particular teaching, all of that can be subject to restrictions because it's external, and when it is external, it touches the lives of others. And then under human rights law, it's generally accepted that you could impose certain restrictions. But those restrictions have to be justified on certain grounds, and that would be grounds like national security.
Religious attire, places of worship and practice, propagation of religion or belief, funeral rites are the four main arenas in which individual members of minority communities or entire minority communities have experienced limitations on their right to freedom of religion or belief in recent decades.
So in the post-war context, Sri Lankan state, which is Sinhala Buddhist state, wanted an enemy. So it started with the Muslim community. Muslims have suffered previously also, but this was very much targeted to the Muslim community. And we have seen many riots, Digana to Ampara to Akurana to Nigambu and Gaul. There have been many riots against the Muslim community. Many have been killed. To date, nobody has been held accountable for those riots. And also there is systematic discrimination against Muslim community. One very painful example has been the cremation of COVID affected dead bodies. Over 300 dead bodies have been cremated, and it's against the religion, and to date those families have not healed from the violence that has been committed on a dead body that can't speak back. So to that level, the Muslim community has been vilified. After the Easter attack, Muslim community is labeled as terrorist, ISS, and also the Muslim community's businesses, professions have been targeted. Dr. Shafi is a good example, and many Muslims have been arrested under ICCPR and PTA combined together in the post-Easter context. More than 2,000 of them have been arrested. And to date, many of them are in prison. I would say about 50 odd Muslims are still not even charged under PTA, have been in prison over 3 years. And also, like, currently the Muslim community has been the target of the Sinhala politics, and particularly Rajapakshas to come back to power. Now they have started vilifying the Muslim community again as terrorists and traitors. So in the post-Easter context, immediately after the bombing, many men were arrested, detained under emergency and PTA and ICCPR also. But women were arrested, taken into custody for wearing the hijab, also the burqa. The combination of laws also have been used against them. At the same time, they were harassed. The women couldn't even move out. Even the private sector, the banks, even shops wouldn't sell them any product. Supermarkets would not let them in. The vehicles, the transport, Pick Me and all these vehicles would not accept them when they call. Even in courtrooms, schools, hospital, any public services where these women access, it has been a huge problem. Some of them have been stripped. The abaya and hijab has been removed in public spaces. In military checkpoints, before even they took their hijab away, the military women cut their hijab. And to date it continues. There was a public administrative circular that was issued then for Muslim women to particularly to wear, like, adhere to sari. But some of these women resisted, some of these women have to resign from their jobs. But even though Human Rights Commission came with the verdict that this public administrative circular should be withdrawn, the government officers, particularly Sinhala officers, the head of the departments, wanted Muslim women to remove their hijab and abaya. So lots of women lost their government jobs.
The Christian clergy particularly have come under attack because they have been active in social movements, whether it be soon after the war, the movement of disappeared families. Christian clergies have been on the forefront, right up to the Aragalaya, where one of the leading figures, Father Jivanta, was a Christian clergy. So because of this active movement of Christian clergies in social movements, the state also has found it easy to frame them as anti-state and attack them. And of course, that will feed into religious tensions and narratives which already exist within our society, and of course, racism. So this is the leadership which Christian clergy and the Christian institutions give for people's struggles is something which the state has found it problematic and worrying. And so therefore, they use racism rather than the ICCPR, I would say. They use the racist narrative or racism in order to weaponize it against Christian community and so on. Department of Archaeology is an instrument of the state which writes history or which excavates history and preserves history. And the Department of Archaeology is functioning inside the Sinhala Buddhist state. So if the state is a Sinhala Buddhist state, then the Department of Archaeology has to simply build that narrative by providing evidence or creating history which would support the narrative. And we see that from the history books we study in school, we see that from the narratives which come out, even official narratives and so on, we see that the history or the ideology being constructed, historical ideology being constructed for the Sinhala Buddhist state. So the reflection of that, the way which archaeological department is constructed, is what we see in the north and the east, where the archaeological department is instrumentalized to create religious sites as Sinhala Buddhist religious sites, even Hindu sites, even sites where we see, for instance, in Trincomalee, the hot wells have now been taken over by a Sinhala Buddhist administration. So the hot wells have, for years, it has been a symbol of Hindu culture in the east, and now it has been taken over by a Sinhala administration. So how is the archaeological department assisting that kind of colonialism or that kind of colonial aggression on minority religious places, and how is the archaeological department aiding this erasure of histories of minorities? I was told by a group of activists, there was an incident where a group of Buddhist monks burnt the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. So when they had tried to lodge a complaint, this group of activists, when they have tried to lodge a complaint with the TID has refused, under the ICCPR Act, the TID has refused to accept the complaint. So if this story which was narrated to me, what is telling is that the state considers ICCPR Section 3 as a legal instrument or a legal weapon to protect Buddhism. So I don't think, for instance, people from the Kurundur Malay, if they try to lodge a complaint under the ICCPR, I do not for one moment think that the police will take it seriously and investigate. Because a minority community complaining against the aggression of a majority community is not considered a sign of causing religious disharmony within the large ideology or within the large state structure of Sri Lanka. It's a situation where the state, the Sinhala Buddhist state, tells us that you have the right to worship, you have the right to be of any faith, but the cutoff point, the extent of the freedom is given by us. It is not determined by you or how much you want to exercise your religion. The extent of that freedom is also determined by us. And if we feel, the Sinhala Buddhist, the state apparatus feels that their ideology and that their status quo is threatened in any way, then they will cut off that freedom. And that is what is happening in the north and the east. So that is one way which we can look at it. And the other way, of course, is that we are in a state of crisis. We need distraction. So we use racism, religious superiority, Sinhala Buddhism to distract these ideas, to distract the Sinhala population from actually talking about the real economic conditions of the country.
மே பார்க்க போனால் மட்டக்களப்பு மாவட்டத்தை பொறுத்த வரைக்கும் வந்துட்டு இந்து மக்களுக்கு எதிரான பாரபட்சங்கள் வன்முறைகள்ன்றது வந்துட்டு உண்மையாகவே யுத்தத்துக்கு பிறகு வரை இல்லை. யுத்தம் நடந்த காலகட்டங்கள்லேயும் வந்துட்டு பல்வேறு வகையான சம்பவங்கள், வன்முறை சம்பவங்கள் வந்து குறிப்பாக இந்து மக்களுக்கு, இந்து ஆலயங்கள் மற்ற திருவிழா காலங்களில் வந்துட்டு அவங்களுக்கு எதிராக நிகழ்த்தப்பட்டிருந்தது. அதில் குறிப்பாக சொல்ல வேணும் என்று சொன்னால் 2009க்கு பிறகு பாக்கைக்குள்ளே வந்துட்டு யுத்தம் முடிஞ்சுது. அதுக்கு பிறகு இங்கே வந்து இராணுவமயமாக்கல் என்ற ஒரு விடயத்தை திணிக்கிறதுக்காக பாரம்பரியமாக இருக்கிற இந்து ஆலயங்கள் வந்து தொல்லியல் திணைக்களத்துக்குள்ள வந்து ஆக்கிரமிக்கப்பட்டு சில ஆலயங்களில் வந்துட்டு முற்றாகவே வழிபாடுகளை மேற்கொள்ள இயலாத நிலைமைகள் காணப்படுது. மற்ற சில ஆலயங்கள் வந்துட்டு யுத்தம் நடைகைக்குள்ளே வந்துட்டு சிதைவடைக்கப்பட்டிருந்தது. அதுவும் யுத்தம் முடிஞ்சதுக்கு பிறகு வந்துட்டு அபிவிருத்தி அந்தந்த இதுகளால் சில ஆலயங்கள் வந்துட்டு புனர் நிர்மாணம் இல்லாமல் கைவிடப்பட்டு நிரந்தரமாகவே அழிக்கப்பட்ட நிலைமைகள் காணப்படுது. அதுக்கு உதாரணமாக அம்பாறை மாவட்டத்தில் எடுக்கக்குள்ள வந்து ஆலம்குளம் என்ற ஒரு இடத்துல வந்து ஒரு ஆலயத்தை குறிப்பிடலாம். மற்றது வந்து இன்னும் ஒரு உதாரணம் சொல்லலாம். மட்டக்களப்பு மாவட்டத்தில் சித்தாண்டி முருகன் ஆலயம் கிட்டத்தட்ட 200-300 வருடங்கள் பழமை வாய்ந்த ஆலயம். அதுவும் கடந்த 2012 தொடக்கம் 2013 இடைப்பட்ட காலப்பகுதியில் வந்து தொல்லியல் திணைக்களத்தால் புராதன ஒரு இடமாக வந்து பிரகடனப்படுத்தப்பட்டு இருக்குது. மற்ற அப்படியான நிறைய இடங்கள் வந்துட்டு இங்கே காணப்படுது.
2009, after the war was over, the attacks on Christians have been increasing. And the reason being, in Sri Lanka, not only the minority religious communities, but the minority ethnic groups have also been under pressure by these extremist forces.
Within hours, a group of Sinhalese nationalists stormed in it.
And even using penal code like Article 81, which talks of religious harmony, that Christians, pastors have been charged under that, saying that you have done things or preached and that has caused religious disharmony. Or under penal code Article 98 again, where noise pollution, they have said worship services has resulted in Article 98 of the penal code being violated, and there have been charges. So these things have been used or manipulated in such a way that the freedom of religion or belief of the Christian community has been affected and curtailed. It's because if you look at our history in our society, you would see that the majority, these extremist groups, have never been tolerant of any kind of minority, or they are really enjoying their rights. So this again you can see being now spelt out in the way they are treating the Christians and the Muslims. And so that's why this whole confusion about during the war there was lesser incidents, and then now after the war the incidents have spiked up. All that is happening. In a way, the physical attacks on places of worship and pastors have decreased, even though last year almost at the same time there was a brutal attack on a pastor in Anuradhapura, and his son was admitted and into hospital, and he was brutally assaulted by I think the cricket wickets, stumps, and he was in hospital. So there have been attacks, but not as much as it was previously, because we as an organization, we have been documenting these incidents, but there has been a change in the way this persecution has now taken place through more state legislations and discrimination. Legislation, proposed legislations. So this is a different turn in what we see is happening from previous physical violence. One is the whole registration. Now there is a new circular, which is actually not new because there was a circular in 2008, then 2011, and then 2022, where initially it said any new places of worship has to be registered within the Ministry of Religious Affairs for it to be deemed legal. Now there is no law as such. There hasn't been, for anything to be law, legislation need to be passed. So there is no legislation, but there is a circular. Now circulars are being considered as law and people are asked to adhere to it. Otherwise, police and the Buddhist priest of that particular district, they go and tell the churches that you are not legal because you are not registered, even though it's not a law. Now under the Right to Information Act, we even inquired from the Religious Affairs Ministry whether this is a law and whether we should adhere to it, and they said no, it is not for Christian places of worship. But even though they say this, in practice it is being almost enforced as if it's law by the police. So we've had several churches which are being closed as illegal because of this circular. So in 2008 it was initially new places of worship. Then in 2011 they said no, all places of worship, and 2022 said any building or premises where there is any religious activity, so even a Bible study or a prayer meeting, will have to be registered, otherwise it is illegal. But now from what we hear from the Religious Affairs Ministry, they are going to bring a new circular or a cabinet decision where every single place of worship has to be registered, and they have to go through a process, including maybe getting approval from the State Intelligence Service, the Grama Sevaka, the Divisional Secretariat, and several layers of authorities who have to approve it before they can be accepted as a registered church. So this is a proposal. We have got some material on that from the Religious Affairs Ministry, but we are looking into it and seeing whether we can legally challenge some of these. Especially in the rural areas, public cemeteries, a lot of burials have been prevented again, not by the state, but by extremist mobs. And they have said, no, this is a Buddhist village, a Buddhist country, and you can't have Christian rites and then have a Christian funeral and bury. And usually burial is by the Muslims and Christians, because Hindus and Buddhists, they cremate. So, but still in public cemeteries, these are not Buddhist cemeteries or any other cemetery, it's public cemeteries, the Christian burial rites have been stopped and they have been prevented from carrying out burials. So this has been a big concern.
Immediately after Easter Sunday, you would remember that emergency regulations were issued and individuals were prevented from wearing certain types of attire, right? And even beyond the emergency regulations, we were exposed to several examples, particularly in certain regions, where individuals wearing hijab or headscarves were asked to take them off when attending work. So we had a situation where religious attire was being restricted on specific grounds such as national security and public order. And then the question arose as to whether this was really an interest that can be legitimately advanced. Was it really about national security, or is it really about the discomfort that the complaining community might have had with the attire? And as we analyze those incidents, we realize that really this is not about national security. It's much more about our comfort levels, our antagonism towards particular attire and towards a particular community. So then national security is not really national, it's the majority's security and insecurity about particular attire. And the prohibition of the headscarf and the prohibition of the niqab, the face covering, became something that was justified on the grounds of national security. So those are some of the examples I think you can see of how minorities become particularly vulnerable to the abuse of limitation regimes.
As a marker of identity and belonging, religion plays a crucial role in coding, essentializing, and affirming ethno-religious identities of different communities living in Sri Lanka. Religious identity has historically been a fault line, which has given rise to occasional tensions and violence between Sri Lanka's Buddhist, Hindu, Islam, and Christian communities before and after the country's independence. Religion or religious identity, however, was not necessarily seen as a root cause for the emergence and continuation of the armed conflict between the Sri Lankan state and Tamil Tiger rebels. But throughout war years, historic and venerated places of worship, religious leaders and worshippers were deliberately targeted by the LTTE. The Anuradhapura massacre in 1985, Arantalava massacre in 1987, attacks on the Temple of Truth in Kandy, the brutal violence inflicted on the Kathankudi and Eravur mosques in 1990 caused great harm to entire religious communities. Collateral damage resulting from war and violence included the destruction of 240 Hindu temples and heavy damages suffered by 1,560 Hindu sites of worship.
Well, I would say that where the war is concerned, ethnicity came to the fore. However, now, for example, LTT attacks against Muslim mosques, if that's what you are, or against, let's say, the Sri Mahabodhi or, the Dalada Maligawa, I don't think it was about religion. I think it was about places that were important to certain communities, because they were sacred places to certain communities. But in my opinion, I don't think religion was the marker of that war. It was ethnicity. However, after the war, what is very problematic is that aside from ethnicity, the political establishment then created another rift by frontally attacking communities on the basis of religion. So now you have two lines, two frontiers of conflict. One is ethnicity, the other is religion.
After the 30-year war ended in May 2009, Sri Lanka witnessed a spike in harassment, persecution and violence against the country's religious minorities. A combination of constitutional limitation regime, doctrinal weaknesses in the current constitution, heightened ethno-nationalist politics, and a pervasive culture of impunity contributed in varying degrees to the escalated animosity against ethno-religious minorities in post-war Sri Lanka. The ongoing economic crisis and the impact of the 2022 Aragalaya protests against the ruling elite may have signaled a temporary shift in politics, priorities, and ethno-nationalist undercurrents in the country. However, the state's decision to arrest stand-up comedian Natasha Edrisuriya, as well as ethno-nationalist reactions to the alleged offence, gave an indication that the causes and conditions that gave rise to past injustices, persecution, and violence against religious minorities in the country still remain unaddressed. A trend analysis report published by the National Christian Evangelical Alliance of Sri Lanka enumerated 397 incidents of violations against the minority Christian community between 2015 and 2019. Compared to the previous 4-year period between 2010 to 2014, while there was a gradual increase in the average number of incidents for a month, there was a drop in the frequency of the number of incidents. From mid-2000s, attacks on Christian churches and places of worship by mobs led by Buddhist monks became commonplace across the country.
මනුෂ්‍ය පාපිෂ්ඨව නැමියාව ඇතුව පාපිෂ්ඨ ස්වභාවය ඇතුව ඉපදුන නිසා මේ පාපයට මනුෂ්‍යගේ ඇදී යාම තියෙනවා. ඒ නිසා පාපිෂ්ඨ මනුස්සයෙකුට බෑ තවත් පාපිෂ්ඨ මනුස්සයෙකුට සහ මිදීමේ මිලයක් වෙන්න. අන්ධයෙක්ට බෑ තවත්. නීතිමය පැත්තෙන් අපි මුල් වතාවේ අපි පොලිසියෙන් නඩු මාර්ගයට යනකොට පොලිසියෙන් නඩු මාර්ගයට ක්‍රියාත්මක කරේ නෑ. ඒගොල්ලෝ අපිට කට වචනෙන් නතර කරන්න කියන එක විතරයි උනේ. මම පුද්ගලික නඩුවක් ගොනු කරා. ඒ වගේම දෙවනි වතාවේ පාසු දවසේ අපි පොලිසියට ගියපු අවස්ථාවේ පොලිසියෙන් තව නඩුවක් ගොනු කරා. ඉතින් මේ නඩු දෙකත් එක්ක මම මූලික අයිතිවාසිකම් නඩු ගොනු කරලා තිබුණා මේ ශ්‍රේෂ්ඨ අධිකරණේ. ඉතින් මේ නඩු දෙකකින් අපිට තීන්දුව ඇවිල්ලා තිබෙනවා මේ නිදහසේ මේ ස්ථානයේ නමස්කාර කරන්න අපිට අයිතිය තියෙනවා යම් අයෙක් ඇවිල්ලා බාධා කළොත් ඒ අය වහම අත්අඩංගුවට ගන්න කියලා. ඉතින් ඒ නියෝගය පොලිසියට දැනුවත් කරාම මහේස්ත්‍රාත්තුමේ පොලිසියෙන් ආගමික නායකයින්ට සහ පළාතේ මිනිසයන්ට දැනුවත් කරා. ඉතින් ඒ වෙනකොට ගොඩක් අපිට විරුද්ධව කටවුට්ස් ගහලා තිබුණා, දේවල් ගහලා තිබුණා, තහනම් කරා කියලා. නමුත් ඒ තීන්දුවෙන් පස්සේ ලොකු නිදහසක් අපිට ලැබිලා තියෙනවා නීතිමය පැත්තෙන් ඒ තීන්දුවත් සමග. ඉතින් මම දැක්ක දේ තමයි නීතිය තිබුණට නීතිය මුලම අවස්ථාවේ කිව්වනම් මෙහෙමයි මේකයි නීතිය කියලා මිනිස්සු කුපිත වෙන්නේ නැහැ. නමුත් නීතිය රකින්න ඕන අයත් නීතිය එහෙම නෙවෙයි කියලා කරපු නිසා තමයි මිනිස්සු කුපිත වෙලා ආවේ. දැන් නීතිය දැනගත්තාම මිනිස්සු ආපස්සට ගිහිල්ලා තේරුම් ගන්න තියෙනවා. හැබැයි මුලින් එහෙම නැති උනේ ඒ නීතියේ තියෙන අයත් මේක නෙවෙයි මෙහෙමයි කියලා ඒ අයගේ පැත්තේ අවනීතිය පැත්තේ හිටගත්ත නිසා. අපිට පොලිසියට ගියාම කියනවා ක්‍රිස්තියානි දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවේ ආණ්ඩුවේ ලියාපදිංචියක් අරන් එන්න. හැබැයි ක්‍රිස්තියානි දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවේ කිසිදු ක්‍රමවේදයක් නැහැ දේවස්ථානයක් හෝ පූජකයෙක් ලියාපදිංචි කරන්න. කතෝලික සභාව ඇරුණු කොටගෙන ක්‍රිස්තියානි දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවේ අනිත් සභාවල් ලියාපදිංචි කිරීමේ කිසි ක්‍රමවේදයක් නැහැ. හැබැයි පල්ලිහා රාජ්‍ය නිලධාරීන් පවා කියනවා ලියාපදිංචි කරන් එන්න. හැබැයි ඉහළ ක්‍රමවේදයක් නැහැ. ඉතින් මේ ක්‍රමවේදයක් පටිපාටියක් නැතිකම නිසා අපි තමයි සමහරවිට මිනිස්සුත් එක්ක හැපෙන වෙලා තියෙන්නේ අපි ගමේ ඉන්න අපිට. ඉතින් මම දකිනවා සමහර ව්‍යවස්ථාවෙන් සමහර දේවල් තිබුණාට මේ ආගමික දෙපාර්තමේන්තුව අතර ක්‍රමවේදයන් හරි විදියට සිදු වෙලා නැහැ. ඉතින් අනිත් එක තමයි අපි විදිහට බලනවා කතෝලික සභාව සහ ක්‍රිස්තියානි කියලා නිකායන් දෙකක් තියෙනවා. කතෝලික නොවන ඉස්කෝලේ විෂය නිර්දේශ පාම දෙකට බෙදලා තියෙනවා. නමුත් ගොඩක් තැන්වල කතෝලික කියන පැත්තට යම් නීති සහ සහාය දීම් තිබුණාට රාජ්‍ය අනුග්‍රහය අනිත් ක්‍රමවේදයට ඇත්තේ ලංකාවේ බහුතරයක් ඉන්නවා. ඒ කතෝලික නොවන විශ්වාසය දරන අය. ඉතින් ඒකට ක්‍රිස්තියානි දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවත් තාම ක්‍රමවේදයක් නැහැ. ඒ චර්ච් එකක් රෙජිස්ටර් කරන්න. ඉතින් අපි ඒ නිසා අපි මේ ස්ථානේ අපි දේවමහයක් කරනවා කියලා අපි රෙජිස්ටර් කරන්න නැති නිසා අපි බලෙන් ලිපි ගොනුවක් බහට දීලා තියෙනවා මෙතන තියෙනවා කියලා දැනුවත් කරන්න.
While all religious minorities in the country have been increasingly targeted in religiously motivated harassment and violence, members of the Muslim community who are adherents of Islam have found themselves being disproportionately targeted in most post-war incidents. Between the 2015 to 2019 period alone, there were 3 acute episodic ethno-religious violence incidents targeting the Muslim community in Gintota, Tigana and Kurunagala in 2017, 2018 and 2019. Members of the Muslim community came under similar incidents of episodic violence in the previous 4-year period too. Many other smaller, localized incidents of harassment and violations faced by the Muslims on everyday basis remained underreported and understudied. Religiously motivated violence against Muslims by militant Buddhist groups led by Buddhist monks in places like Alutkama, Gintota and Digana were never investigated in an impartial manner to serve justice to the victims and their families and hold perpetrators to account. Carrying out impartial prosecutorial proceedings and bringing those responsible for the infliction of violence to justice is an important part of deterring and preventing similar future incidents. The state's lack of commitment or action to deal with each episode of religiously motivated violence reinforced a culture of impunity prevailing in Sri Lanka in relation to crimes committed against ethno-religious minorities, while reconfirming after each incident the unequal treatment and status of the country's religious minorities compared to the majority community. Prior to the 19th century, different religious communities coexisted side by side for centuries. There were many sites and places of worship that embody the tradition of interfaith coexistence between communities. The Katharagama Temple Complex, Adams Peak, the Temple of Tooth, and St. Anthony's Church in Kochikade are the most well-known sites of religious interface and syncretism, where different religious groups observe similar rituals. The Katharagama Temple Complex is visited by thousands of devotees belonging to all key religious communities living in Sri Lanka. Similarly, the majority Buddhist community make annual pilgrimages to the Adams Peak, which they believe was visited by Lord Buddha during his third visit to Sri Lanka, while Islam, Hindu and Christian worshippers believe the site was sanctified by their founder or god. The Temple of Tooth, which holds and protects the sacred tooth relic of Buddha, also hosts Hindu shrine kovils conveying a combination of historic links between religious traditions and incorporation of deities of Hinduism in popular Buddhism. Buddhist and other religious communities pay homage to this venerated site all year round. The Kochikade Catholic Church is another place of worship that epitomizes the strength and glory of religious syncretism etched in the social fabric of Sri Lanka. Linkages and close interactions between religious leaders from diverse religious groups and their participation in common religious peace-building and social welfare activities have been important for further fostering of interfaith coexistence among different ethno-religious groups. Since the beginning of the armed conflict, local and international peace-building organizations have taken efforts to build on and strengthen interfaith coexistence among the conflict-torn communities in Sri Lanka.
සෑම ආගමකම ඉන්න අන්තවාදී කණ්ඩායමක්. ඒක සාමාන්‍යයෙන් අද නෙමෙයි එදා කාලේ ඉඳලම තිබුණා.
දැන් බුද්ධ ධර්මයේ විශේෂයෙන් ගත්තොත් බුදුහාමුදුරන්ගේ ධර්මයත් විකෘති කරලා දේශනා කරන හැටි චබ්බග්ගය සුණාතේ සාති මේගිය වගේ හාමුදුරුවෝ. ඉතින් එතනදිත් බුදුරජාණන් වහන්සේගේ ධර්මය නමුත් විනාශ වුණේ නැහැ, ඒක ආරක්ෂා වුණානේ, මේ දක්වා ආරක්ෂාලා තියෙනවා. ඉතින් ප්‍රධාන වශයෙන් හැම ආගමක් තුළ බුදුහාමුදුරන් වහන්සේත් අන්‍ය ආගම මතවලට කවදාකවත් ගැරහුවේ නැහැ, ඒවා ගරු කරා. ඒවට ගරු කරන්න කියලා කිව්වා. ඉතින් හැම ආගමකටම ඒ වගේම අන්‍ය ආගමික සමගත් ඉතාමත් සංහිඳියාවෙන් අපේ බුදුහාමුදුරුවෝ කටයුතු කරලා තියෙනවා. ඉතින් එතෙන්දී ඒක හැබැයි අර මම ප්‍රධානම කලින් කිව්වා වගේම ඒක ආගමික අනුගාමිකයන් අතර නැති එක තමයි ප්‍රධාන ප්‍රශ්නේ තියෙන්නේ. අනේ එතෙන්ට යන්න අවශ්‍ය මූලික පදනම හදන්න ඕනේ මට පාසල් පද්ධතිය. ඉතින් පාසල් දරුවෙක් හොඳ මානසිකත්වයකින් හැම ආගමකට ගරු කරන, ඒ වගේම ආගමික මතවාදත් එක්ක අන්තගාමීව නොගීව කටයුතු කරන හොඳ සහනශීලී පිළිවෙතක් තියෙන සංහිඳියාව යුතු දරුවෙක් පාසලෙන් එළියට આવොත් මම හිතන්නේ ඉදිරියේදී මේ ගැටුම් ඇති වෙන එකක් නෑ කියලා හිතනවා. ඒ ආගමික නිදහස සම්බන්ධයෙන් ඇත්තටම කාටත් පොදු අයිතියක් තියෙන්න ඕන කියලා මගේ ආදර්ශය තියෙනවා. ඒ කියන්නේ හේතුව Tamanට ඕන නිදහස් ඒක ව්‍යවස්ථාවෙත් එහෙම තියෙනවනේ. Tamanට සෛර්ය වෙන අවශ්‍ය ආගමක් අදහන්න ඒ තියෙන අයිතිය තියෙනවා.
The 2019 Easter Sunday's bombings, which resulted in 270 deaths and over 500 casualties, caused a lot of damage to inter-ethnic coexistence of the different communities. 4 years after the incident, Sri Lanka's government has yet to bring the perpetrators to justice. A documentary produced and aired in September 2023 by the UK's Channel 4 TV interviewed Sri Lankan whistleblowers who alleged that certain senior government officials were complicit in the Easter Sunday's bombings. These new allegations increased calls by domestic and international groups for an independent international level investigation into the incident. In response to the Channel 4 documentary, Sri Lanka's current president announced the appointment of 2 new committees, and immediately the Catholic Church expressed its lack of confidence in such domestic level measures, given that similar previous inquiries failed to get to the bottom of the incident. Up to now, inquiries have been conducted by a presidential committee, a presidential commission of inquiry, and a parliamentary select committee. Under the prosecutorial process, over 23,000 charges were filed against the suspects and 1,215 witnesses summoned to testify. Bureaucratic delays and lack of progress in the prosecutorial process has strained the goodwill and cordial relations between the state and the country's influential Catholic clergy, while raising doubts among the Catholic minority community, who are both Sinhala and Tamil in their ethnic origin, of their equal treatment and status before the law.
In September 2019, then President Maithripala Sirisena subsequently appointed a 5-member presidential commission to investigate the attacks and determine where responsibility for the security lapses lay.
Presidential Council, they gave a report telling that former president and some officials must be prosecuted. So that is the conclusion in that report. But that report was given to former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. But still he didn't work out those recommendations. He blocked that recommendations. So in that way, we cannot get the justice. If he is ready to prosecute Mr. Maithripala Sirisena, former president, so if he comes to the court, we believe that he will reveal so many things, because we know that he has so many secrets. That is why we believe that on that day he was not in the country, he is out of the country. He had gone to Singapore for, we don't know for what reason. So purposely he avoided this situation. That is why he went to Singapore. So we believe that he has so many secrets. So that is why if he is brought to the court, he will reveal the whole truth behind this bomb attack. We know that one day God will give us that justice that we are expecting. Because we have seen so many miracles. Now even Cardinal himself told that if somebody is trying to come to the power with the blood of these innocent people, he cannot remain in the power. He cannot rule the country. So same thing happened. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, he was so powerful. He is coming from the Rajapaksa family, very, very powerful political family, and he had people's power. He was very popular among people. Two-thirds majority from the presidential election he took. So he was so powerful, was banished from the country. So we believe that is a miracle.
This march for justice over a distance of nearly 40 kilometers from Katuapitiya Church in Negombo to St. Anthony's Church in Kochikade was organized by the Catholic community in April 2023 to demand justice from the state to the victims and their families.
මගේ මහත්යාව මගෙනුත් දුවලා දෙන්නගෙනුත් වෙන් කරේ අද වගේ අඳුරු දවසක ඇත්තටම අපිට හිතා ගන්න බෑ අවුරුදු 4ක් ගිහිල්ලා එච්චර ආදරෙන් හිටිය මගේ හස්බන්ඩ් නැතුව මං කොහොමද හුස්ම ගන්නේ කියලා මට තාම හිතා ගන්න බෑ ඇත්තටම දෙවියන් වහන්සේගෙන් පුදුම ශක්තියක් අපිට ලැබෙනවා යුක්තිය නැති වෙන එකට ඇත්තටම මේ ප්‍රශ්නේ එක දිගටම කවුරුත් කරගෙන යන්නේ නැහැ කඩින් කඩ අර කාදිනල්තුමා කිව්වා වගේ වරින් වර එක එක වාසි තකාගෙන එක එක බලලෝභයට තණ්හාවල් වල පස්සේ තමයි යන්නේ ඒක නිසා මට හිතෙන්නේ මේ යුක්තිය එළියට එන්නේ නැත්තේ ඉතින් මං හිතනවා එයාලගේ ඒ පවුල් වල කාට හරි මෙහෙම දෙයක් වුණොත් එයාලට දැනේවි කවදා හරි කොච්චර වේදනාවක් දුකක් හිස්තැනක් ඉතුරු වෙනවද අපිට අපේ ජීවිත ගෙනිය ගන්න බැරි තරමටම අපි කඩා වැටෙනවා. ඉතින් මං හිතන්නේ ඒ සත්‍ය තමයි අපි ඉල්ලන්නේ මේ ජනතාව අපි ඔක්කොම 272 දෙනාගේම පවුලේ ඥාතීන් හැම කෙනෙක්ම ඉල්ලන්නේ ඒ ශක්තිය. මොකද මට ස්වාමි පුරුෂයෙක්වත් දරුවෝ දෙන්නට තාත්තා කෙනෙක්වත් නෙමෙයි අපි ඉල්ලන්නේ මේ මරුණු අපේගේ ආදරණීයන් වෙනුවෙන් යුක්තිය සහ සත්‍යය.
We feel that those who are responsible seem to be part of the whole investigation process. That's all I think we can say at this particular moment. Because if not, we don't understand why the investigations have got to be, halted at different levels. Because we know that things have not got pushed in the right direction. So they have stopped at a particular point, and we know at that particular point there are some sort of leaders or leadership probably are involved, and no investigations are possible beyond that particular point. So that is our issue. If justice is to be sought in a different political setting, then we have a big question. Which means that justice in this country will not be able to be arrived at without having a particular type of government who will support us in this whole journey. Whereas what we need is the upholding of the rule of law. If rule of law is sort of respected, no government matters for justice. So that's where we are actually pushing, because we know that behind this whole carnage there is this political, the background which is highly sort of full of corruption, and we don't know how to call that type of, the scenarios behind our political culture.
Meanwhile, in Katankudi in the Batticaloa district, where the mastermind of the attacks came from, many Muslim men and women were kept in remand custody for months on end. Human rights activists identified most of those in remand custody as collateral damage. Muslim women from Kathankudi made up a larger portion of those falling under the category of collateral damage, as both kept inside remand prison as suspects for aiding and abetting the attackers or family members and caregivers of male suspects in remand custody.
So, in the post-Easter context, about 19 odd women have been arrested and charged under PTA. Interestingly, there have been many women who are married with children. Their husbands were also taken in custody. Some children were also taken into custody. So we have to grapple with a lot of young children who didn't have both parents being locked up. And out of that, I think 18 of them have come out, but still they are on bail. And on the other hand, over 300 odd Muslim men have been arrested and framed as terrorists under PTA, but not charged. Many of them have come on bail, but their cases are not dismissed. So those women suffered a lot, because generally Muslim women, Kathankudi alone, I think over 100 odd men have been taken under custody. So those women became single, women-headed families for over 3 years. And these women are also coming from very conservative family background. Many of them have been married off at a very young age, so they never went out to find a job or to find livelihood or to even to access lawyers, visit prison. It has been hugely complicated. And then there has been surveillance on them. The various intelligence groups would visit their houses and all. Then the community itself isolated them, saying that they are connected to Sahran or the suicide bomber group, or they are because of the surveillance around them, nobody gave them any job. So they were even struggling to have a decent meal. Many of these women have told that they have to sell their properties, one and only property, the house, or mortgaging the house and land, not only to pay for legal aid, but also to bribe the intelligence system. Every time they came or they went to prison or to visit their family members, they have to bribe the prison guard to the intelligence officers, and because they promise them that they will expedite their cases and release them and all those things. So quite a lot of sum of money, they sold their jewelry and everything valuable that is in the house in order to bribe the structures. So they have become paupers now. With a country of this nature, where on and off it is the Muslim women who are targeted, because they are the visible carrier of the religious identity of the Muslim community. So at some point they were called Goni Billas, because they were wearing this black kabaya. In fact, some of the Buddhist extremist group call them evil. And whenever there is security issues with regard to majority community or national security, the Muslim women's attire and their body is being seen as a security threat. Even though all the suicide bombers who blow the hotels and churches happen to be men, it has been the Muslim women's bodies and attire that has been vilified and connected to terrorism.
This unresolved crime also made the entire Muslim community further vulnerable to demonization, persecution, and mob violence, which inevitably invoked more limitations on their freedoms, including the freedom to exercise religious and cultural practices. In mobilizing hate speech and disinformation against Muslims, various ultra-nationalist groups took to the internet-based social media platforms. Easy access to social media, its networked architecture, and lack of application of community standards by the platform administrators enabled various groups to escalate the anti-Muslim rhetoric online, while encouraging people's participation in offline violence against Muslim businesses and private properties. While there has been a noticeable improvement in countering anti-minority narratives by the younger generations, particularly on social media spaces, more remains to be done to witness lasting changes at societal level. The Easter Sunday's violence has seen an increase in grassroots-based activities of the sectarian Siv Senai and Ravana Senai groups, whose presence in Sri Lanka goes back more than a dozen years. These groups boast strong ties to Hindu sectarian groups in India and take cues from their Indian counterparts, who the rights activists and organizations hold responsible for recent extremist activities and vigilante attacks against Muslim and Christian minorities in India. Human rights and peace-building activists and organizations have repeatedly red-flagged in public forums an acceleration in the transitioning of anti-Muslim and anti-Christian rhetoric peddled by Shiv Senai, Rudra Senai and Ravana Senai groups from online to offline spaces in the north and east.
இந்த வகை இலங்கையை பொறுத்த வரைக்கும் வந்துட்டு ப்ளூரலிசம், அதாவது பெண்மைத்துவம் சார்ந்து வந்து இன்னமும் நாங்கள் பாடசாலை மட்டங்கள்லேருந்து எங்களோட பிள்ளைகளுக்கு வந்துட்டு நாங்கள் கற்றுக் கொடுக்க வேணும். மற்றது தனிப்பட்ட ஒரு நபராக நாங்களும் அந்த ப்ளூரலிசம் என்ற முக்கியத்துவம் அதை ஏற்றுக்கொண்டு நாங்கள் எடுக்க வேணும். மற்றது வந்துட்டு வயலன்ஸ் எக்ஸ்ட்ரீமிசம், அதாவது வன்முறை தீவிரவாதம் என்ற ஒரு விடயம் இதுக்குள்ளே இருக்குது. அது கூடுதலாக வந்து உங்களுக்கு தெரியும், அதாவது சில அண்மை காலங்களில் நடந்த சில சம்பவங்களுக்கு இன்னும் நீதி கிடைக்கல, இன்னும் அந்த குறிப்பிட்ட ஒரு மக்கள் இவங்க தான் குற்றம் செய்தன்னு சொல்லி அந்த முற்கற்பிதமான பாத்திரங்கள் கருத்துக்களை வந்துட்டு மக்கள் உருவாக்கி வாராங்களா. அப்போ அதால் இந்த வன்முறை தீவிரவாதம் வந்துட்டு வந்து கொண்டிருக்குது. அப்போ அதுகளை தடுக்கிற வகையில் நாங்கள் செயற்படுற பட்சத்தில் உண்மையாகவே இதுகளை கொண்டு வரணும். ஆனால் எந்த தனிப்பட்ட கருத்து தனிப்பட்ட ஒரு நபரோட மனநிலையில் எப்போ மாற்றம் வருதோ அன்றைக்கு தான் வந்துட்டு நாங்கள் செய்யலாம். பிறக்கைக்குள்ளே யாருமே வந்துட்டு இந்த இனத்தையோ மதத்தையை வச்சு பிறக்கே இல்லை. இந்த சமூகம்தான் எங்களுக்கு இந்த அடையாளங்கள் மதத்துகளையே வந்துட்டு தந்திருக்குது. அப்போ தந்த பட்சத்தில் வந்துட்டு நாங்கள் அதை சரியான முறையில் நாங்கள் அதை கடைப்பிடித்து அடுத்து வர சந்ததிக்கும் அதை சரியான முறையில் அவங்க அதை வழிநடத்தி செல்றதுக்கு நாங்கள் பாவிக்க வேணுமே தவிர மனித குலத்தை நாசமாக்குறதுக்கு பாவிக்கக்கூடாது.
If Sri Lanka's religious minorities are to enjoy freedom of religion or belief, reforms and transformations must take effect at multiple levels, from constitutional to judicial and political to societal. While addressing the ongoing economic crisis, which has brought Sri Lanka to its knees, resolution of social justice issues, including the treatment of the country's ethno-religious communities as second-class citizens, should be treated as a priority. Only through an intersectional approach to Sri Lanka's multiple crises will a system change that many Sri Lankans rallied behind during the 2022 Aragalaya can be achieved.